German engineers built flying-wing bomber. In 1944, U.S. captured it, realized it was B-2 stealth, 50 years early, April 14, 1945. Friedrich Roda, Thuringia. The war had pushed spring out of the hills and left only the smell of damp stone and cold oil. We eased through the broken doors of Gothaer Wagenfabrik with our pistols drawn and our words kept small, the way men talk inside churches and mine shafts. My flashlight cone cut a pale road through the dark and found nothing but shadows shaped like machines that no longer cared who won. The first thing I noticed was the hush. Not silence. Hush. The kind of held breath that makes you lower your shoulders without meaning to. Paper fluttered somewhere, a draft moving through the ribs of the building. A drop of something, water or solvent, let go from a beam and clicked against concrete. My boot slid on a smear of graphite. The air tasted like iron and glue. "Left, sir," Morrison whispered behind me, the barrel of his carbine nudging the dark as if it could be prodded into telling the truth. I swung the light, and the beam ran across jigs and forms, a scaffolded fuselage that had quit halfway through becoming itself, a tailplane wrapped in muslin like a broken arm, all of it familiar enough to belong to the world we knew. And then the world ended. It lay in the near distance like a fallen piece of night, a shape that the eye wanted to explain and could not. No fuselage, no tail, no comforting vertical fin to reassure you that this thing answered to the same rules as everything else that had flown since Kitty Hawk. Just a vast black wing, low and predatory, the edges swept as if it had been drawn by wind rather than men. My light licked across its skin and came back confused. No aluminum gleam, no rivet constellations, only a dark matte surface that swallowed reflection. We walked to it because there was nothing else to do. Up close, the skin was not metal, but something layered and grainy, warm to the touch from a day's trapped heat. The panel joins were clean, the intakes tucked tight into the wing's roots. At the leading edge, my knuckles found a hard seam, and beneath the varnish I could feel wood, honest wood, pressed and bonded and blackened with something that stained my fingertips. The smell here was stronger, resin, sawdust, a bitter hint of burnt sugar that comes when glue cures too hot. On a trestle beside the thing, plans were pinned beneath a wrench and a chipped coffee cup. The title block wrote itself into my light in a tidy hand. Horten Ho 2/29 via 3. Another page offered numbers underlined twice, a neat German word that did not belong to our vocabulary yet, Radarquerschnitt, and in pencil a note, Mischung mit Kohle, mixture with charcoal. Morrison broke the hush without meaning to. "What kind of bomber is that, sir?" "The kind that doesn't want to be seen," I said, and heard the certainty in my own voice before I had earned it. I walked the wing span with my palm, 36, 37 steps edge to edge, counting because numbers were the only handhold I had left. At the root, a cutout ended in a rib stamped V3, the third of its name. The jet bays were empty, but you could see where the mounts waited for engines that would never arrive. I set the flashlight on the plans and opened the next sheet. Someone had sketched a British radar lobe and shaded a slim, swept triangle slipping through it like a fish. Arrows showed energy bent away instead of back. There were margins full of small experiments, swatches of material, strips darkened with something ground fine, a thumbprint where a man had tested tack and left himself behind. "We need staver," I said. "Now, trucks, riggers, the lot, and a photographer who knows which end to point." "Sir," Morrison said, But his eyes were still on the wing. Men raised on propellers and tails find ways to be brave, but tonight I saw awe in him and maybe a little fear of the future. I stepped back far enough to see the whole thing at once. It had the quiet menace of a blade left on a table. I thought of the Reichsmarschall's fantasies and our bombers over the Ruhr, and the way new ideas arrive like weather. Too late to save the men who dreamed them, just in time to change the maps for everyone else. If we had come 6 months earlier, we would have found drawings. 6 months later, perhaps vapor trails over the channel. The beam of my light climbed the far wall and found a slogan half painted, half sanded off. The last 2 letters clung there, white against gray like bones. We thought we knew what the end of the war would look like. It didn't. It looked like this: a black wing asleep in a dead factory, waiting for whichever side found it first. Before I learned to read the world in edges and echoes, I read it in the lines of my father's knuckles and the sound of a lathe cutting true. He owned a small machine shop in Joliet, where winter got into the hinges and stayed, and the summer smelled like cutting oil and hot steel. My first measure of patience was a micrometer. My first prayer was the tiny curl of bright swarf falling away from a clean pass. When I was 12, he let me tram the mill, my cheek near the dial, breath held, chasing zeros, because zeros meant the world would behave. College wasn't in the cards unless I could make it myself. Nights I took drafting courses in a cinder block classroom behind a rail yard, learning how to turn a thing you could imagine into a thing you could measure. I loved the language of it, the shy radii, the center lines, the way a toleranced note could command metal like a general and yet apologize for heat growth with a plus was. I thought if I could draw the world carefully enough, I might not be surprised by it. Then the world surprised everyone. December 7th. I heard it on the radio above the machines, a tinny voice climbing over the belt noise, and men who had been boys when Pershing marched found their hats and did not meet each other's eyes. I enlisted as a private because it felt indecent to hesitate. They discovered I could draw a rivet head so faithfully you could feel the knurl between your fingers, and they made me a technician. Later, someone noticed I could also keep my hand steady while pointing a camera in places it wasn't wanted. The Army taught me new names for old instincts: photo recon instead of patience, field sketch instead of drafting, intelligence instead of curiosity. Somewhere along the way, I grew into lieutenant without quite noticing. Responsibility always arrives like a coat handed to you in a room where everyone else is cold. They shipped me to England with a case full of lenses and a notebook that smelled like glue. I learned the taste of blackout tea and the weight of silence in briefing rooms. We studied the Luftwaffe like watchmakers peer at escapements. The way a Me-262's tail flicked when it rolled, the shadows V-2s cast on their launch rails at noon. I sat with men who could look at a blurry aerial and tell you a story about the next month of your life. We were wrong as often as we were right. War turns even the best estimates into confessions. Somewhere in those months, I married a girl in a photograph. Her name was Ruth, and she wrote me letters that smelled faintly of soap and library stacks. She taught school in a red brick building 3 blocks from the river. She sent me a pressed ginkgo leaf between 2 pages about patience from Ecclesiastes. I kept it in my map case and lied to it about how careful I was being. When we crossed into France after the hedgerows had given up their secrets, I learned how factories sound when they have been emptied in a hurry. Papers underfoot, chalk still wet on a blackboard, an ashtray where the last cigarette fell. I learned to find meaning in what was missing. The jig you needed left behind, but the special tool gone. The crate stenciled with a destination someone hoped to reach in time. The brass called our little detachment T-Force, which made us sound like men who kicked doors. Mostly we carried notebooks and wrote down ghosts. I told myself I was not a combat officer, that my war was pencils and film and caution. Then we walked into a U-boat pen made of poured dreams and rebar, and a corporal bled out against my sleeve while I held his hand and lied as well as anyone ever has. Caution makes no promises. After that, I stopped telling myself stories about what kind of soldier I was. If there's a reason I remember the feel of that black wing under my palm more than the day I first saw a jet fly, it's because it married everything I had been before to everything the war had made of me. It was line and arc and tolerance and guesswork. It was draftsmanship and terror. It said, the future belongs to the men who can make themselves invisible, and the rest of you must learn to hear with more than your ears. I still wrote to Ruth. I told her about the hills and the bread and the stubborn, cheerful chickens that seemed to survive every artillery table ever drawn. I didn't tell her about the way some ideas feel like bullets. A good engineer honors the things he cannot measure, but he does not burden those he loves with their math. April 14th, 1945, 08:42 a.m. The sun finally broke through the smoke-stained windows of the WWII factory, and for the first time, we could see the full shape of the thing sprawled before us. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was an idea, and ideas in wartime are as dangerous as weapons. The light ran along the curves of the black wing like fingers tracing a secret. Dust hung in the air, and each particle turned gold as it passed through the beam. The silence was deep enough to hear my pulse against my collar. Morrison shifted beside me, his boots scuffing against the floor. He was young, maybe 21, and still believed that curiosity was safe. "What if it flies?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer, because I didn't know. The engineers from T-Force arrived before noon, 6 men in rumpled uniforms, smelling of diesel and paper. Captain Staver led them, a slide rule clipped to his breast pocket, his face drawn thin from too much coffee and too little rest. He didn't salute. None of us did anymore. "Report," he said. I handed him the folder I'd found on the workbench. He flipped through it quickly, stopping when his thumb brushed across a set of drawings labeled Ho Nime V3, Jet Flugel ohne Leitwerk. No tail, no fuselage, just wing. He stared for a long moment, then looked at me. "You know what this is, Lieutenant?" "Something impossible," I said. He grunted. "Not impossible, just early." The team spread out across the hangar. One man began measuring the span with a tape line. Another tapped the surface and frowned at the dull, hollow sound. "Wood," he said. "Plywood, I think, but reinforced." Another engineer scraped a small sample from the edge of the wing. The black dust clung to his fingers. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, lifted it to his nose. "Charcoal," he murmured. "They mixed it into the resin." "Charcoal?" Morrison said. "What for?" "To make it disappear," the engineer replied. "To radar." We all looked at him. He smiled faintly, as if embarrassed by the words. "I read a report once. The British are using radar to track bombers. If you could absorb the signal instead of reflecting it..." He trailed off, realizing how absurd it sounded out loud. But the black wing behind him made it less absurd than it should have been. Staver crouched near one of the empty jet bays. "Two Jumo 004s, he said. "Same engines as the Me-262. If this thing flew, it could have hit London before they knew it was coming." He looked up at me. "Find the engines, Meyer. Find out if they built more." I nodded, but I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the chalk marks on the concrete, the outlines of wings drawn by hand, the numbers smudged by boot soles. Around them were coffee cups, cigarette stubs, a jacket left on a chair. The men who'd worked here had left fast. The war was ending, but they had still believed in something, enough to leave it unfinished, yet perfectly shaped. At the far wall, someone had scrawled a note in white chalk. "Fliegen wird uns retten. Flying will save us." Morrison read it aloud, then said, "Did it?" I didn't answer him either. Outside, we heard the rumble of trucks on the road, American by the sound, reinforcements or recovery crews, or both. I looked once more at the black wing. It seemed to drink the light instead of reflecting it. It was hard not to think of ghosts, of how many we'd buried because they hadn't seen the thing coming. Later that night, I stood outside the hangar and smoked one of Staver's cigarettes. The sky above Friedrich-Roda was low and gray, and for the first time in weeks, there were no bombers overhead. The only sound was the slow drip of rainwater from the gutters. I thought about how we had spent years trying to see the enemy, on radar screens, through binoculars, in photographs. And here, at the end of it all, I was looking at the future, a machine designed not to be seen at all. That was the moment I realized the war wasn't ending. It was just changing shape. When I went back inside, Morrison was asleep against a crate. The engineers had finished their notes and locked the plans in a crate marked "Property of U.S. Army." I turned off my flashlight, leaving only the faint moonlight slanting through the high windows. It fell across the wing, and for a second I swore the shadows moved, as if it were breathing. The sound I made wasn't a prayer, but it was close. When the dust settled that night, the only thing left echoing in the hangar was the hum of a generator and the thought I couldn't shake. We just found the future in the ruins of the past. We stayed in Friedrich-Roda for 4 days. 4 days of rain, damp uniforms, and a silence so dense it clung to every breath. You could tell the war was collapsing, not by the gunfire, but by its absence. The Luftwaffe had vanished from the sky. The Wehrmacht had melted into the forests. And yet here, inside this empty factory, it felt as though the war was beginning again. The engineers worked through the night, cataloging every scrap of blueprint, every loose bolt, every forgotten tool. I stood watch, because it gave me something to do besides think. The black wing loomed over us, huge and quiet, lit by the yellow cones of our lamps. It looked less like a machine and more like an animal sleeping beneath a blanket of dust. The men from Staver's team argued constantly about lift coefficients, airflow, resonance. The words tumbled over each other in English and German, a chorus of curiosity that somehow felt holier than the hymns I'd grown up with. The Germans had dreamed in geometry. They had poured the last of their empire's genius into this shape, even as the walls were closing in around them. Late on the second night, Staver found me at the edge of the hangar, notebook in hand. His eyes were ringed with exhaustion, but his voice was alive. "Do you see what they did here, Maya?" he said. No fuselage, no tail, no drag. The lift-to-drag ratio alone. He broke off, shaking his head. They were 10 years ahead of us, maybe more. 10 years won't matter if they lose, I said. He looked up from the plans. It always matters, because someone else will find it. I didn't answer, because I knew he was right. When dawn came, a light fog rolled through the hills. We hauled the wing halves out of the hangar and onto flatbeds, their edges wrapped in tarps. The trucks growled down the road toward Cherbourg, where ships waited to carry them west. Morrison stood beside me, watching them go. "Think it'll fly again, sir?" he asked. "Everything flies again," I said, "just under a different flag." That afternoon, we searched the smaller workshops behind the main hangar. We found molds, wooden ribs, and one unpainted frame. Another Horton, half-finished, its bones exposed. Hanging on a wall was a chalkboard covered in equations and quick sketches of airflow around swept wings. At the bottom, written in neat, precise German, "Flug ohne Schatten," flight without shadow. It was then that the scale of it began to sink in. This wasn't one man's experiment. It was an idea spreading like electricity through a dying empire. They were trying to erase themselves from the sky, to build machines the enemy couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't even imagine. That night, as the engineers packed their instruments, I sat outside the hangar and listened to the wind moving through the pines. The rain had stopped, but the smell of oil and resin lingered on my clothes. In the distance, artillery flashed against the clouds. Not ours, not theirs, just thunder misnamed. A German civilian approached from the road, an old man in a tattered coat. He carried a bicycle with a broken chain. "Cinzi Americana?" he asked. I nodded. He looked toward the hangar. "You will take it away?" "Yes," I said. He was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "It is beautiful, isn't it?" I wanted to tell him it wasn't beauty, it was ambition turned inside out. But I couldn't, because standing there, in that ghost of a nation's workshop, I knew he was right. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that frightens you. The next morning, we buried 3 German workers behind the factory, men who had been shot by SS patrols for refusing to destroy the blueprints before we arrived. Staver gave a short prayer. None of us knew their names. The crosses we made were uneven. On the 5th day, we received orders to move east. The Russians were closing in on Berlin, and our unit was to follow the front line. The Ho 229 would travel west, we would travel toward the smoke. As the convoy rolled out, I looked back once. The hangar was already empty, the floor swept clean, the space too large for its own silence. The war wasn't over. It had just gone underground, into the hands of men with notebooks, into laboratories where silence was currency. I realized then that we hadn't defeated the German engineers. We had inherited them. We left Friedrichsroda 2 days later, heading north through villages that looked like sketches left unfinished. Smoke hung over the rooftops. Children watched from behind shattered windows. No one waved. The war had shrunk everything, maps, houses, faces, until the world itself seemed smaller than the machines that had torn it apart. Our convoy moved slowly, engines whining in second gear. The Ho 229 crates rode on flatbeds at the front, draped in canvas and marked with stenciled warnings, "Technische Beute," handle with care. "Technical loot," one of the engineers translated, half smiling. No one else did. By the 3rd night, rain began to fall again, thin, cold, and relentless. The windshield wipers squealed against the glass, beating in time with the tired rhythm of the road. Morrison rode beside me, chin tucked into his collar. "You ever think we're stealing ghosts, sir?" he asked suddenly. "Ghosts?" He gestured toward the trucks ahead. "That thing back there, it's not ours." "Not really? Feels like we're grave robbers digging up the future." I didn't answer right away. The word future hit harder than I expected. I thought about the black wing, its skin cold and smooth under my hand, and how it had looked less like a weapon than a promise. "We're not grave robbers," I said finally. "We're witnesses." Morrison nodded, though his eyes stayed on the rain. "Doesn't feel different." He was right. It didn't. That night, we reached an abandoned Luftwaffe airfield near Kassel. The hangars were half burned, their roofs caved in like broken lungs. We set up camp in what was left of a mess hall. Stavr unrolled his blueprints on a wooden table pocked with cigarette burns. The engineers crowded around, arguing over center of gravity, drag coefficients, and the impossible symmetry of the Horton design. "It's genius," one said, "but it's madness too. You can't build stability into a ghost." Stavr rubbed his eyes. "No," he said, "but you can try." I poured coffee that tasted like rainwater and listened. The words blurred into the same feverish mix I'd heard since we'd found the thing. Awe, envy, fear. Men were already dreaming of what came next. They didn't see what I saw. The faces of the 3 Germans we'd buried, their hands still stained with resin. They didn't hear what I heard. The hiss of air over that black skin, the whisper of an idea too far ahead for the world to deserve it. Later, I stepped outside. The clouds were low, the air thick with the smell of mud and fuel. Off to the east, faint flashes marked the Russian advance. Thunder or artillery, it no longer mattered. I took out my notebook and wrote a line I didn't understand until much later. "We captured more than a machine today. We captured the next war." The next morning, we loaded the crates onto a larger transport heading for Cherbourg. The paperwork listed the cargo simply as experimental aircraft components. No mention of radar absorption, no mention of invisibility. The future always travels under false names. As the trucks rolled away, I watched them disappear into the fog and felt something shift inside me, a small, cold fracture. I'd spent 3 years collecting evidence of destruction, but this was different. This wasn't wreckage, it was birth. And in that birth, I understood what victory really meant. Not freedom, not peace, but possession. The war had taught us to take everything apart and call it progress. When I climbed back into the Jeep, Morrison handed me a folded piece of paper. "Found this in one of the toolboxes," he said. It was a photograph. 2 young men standing beside a small wooden glider, both smiling, wind tugging at their shirts. On the back, in neat handwriting, Reimar und Walter, 1933. I turned it over, staring at the boys who had built the shape that would haunt my dreams for the next 50 years. I imagined them working in a shed somewhere, believing they were building beauty instead of a weapon. "They look happy," Morrison said. "They thought they were inventing flight," I said quietly, not hiding from it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the black wing in my mind, its edges sharp as gilt, its surface swallowing the light. For the first time, I wondered whether the line between discovery and damnation had ever really existed at all. When dawn came, I wrote Ruth another letter I would never send. I told her that war doesn't end when the guns stop. that sometimes it ends in a factory, when you realize the enemy wasn't evil, just ahead of you. And as the trucks disappeared west, I felt the strangest ache, pride for what we'd found and dread for what we would do with it. That was the turning point, the moment I understood that victory was not about who could see the other first. It was about who could disappear last. The gun stopped speaking before our minds did. In May 1945, the radios began whispering words we hadn't believed we'd hear again. Ceasefire, unconditional surrender, peace. They sounded foreign, like a language we'd forgotten how to pronounce. The front folded inward. The maps came down. The world exhaled for the first time in 6 years, and yet inside us, the noise kept echoing. Our convoy reached Cherbourg under a sky the color of lead. The docks were a maze of cranes and crates, V-2 rockets, Me-262s, torpedoes, and the sealed boxes containing our prize, Horton Ho 229 V3. Men stamped documents without reading them. Forklifts groaned. Everything smelled of salt and oil and endings. Captain Staver supervised the loading. "Handle with care," he said, though his voice cracked on care. The crew obeyed as if they were packing away a relic, not a weapon. I watched as the crate slid into the hold of HMS Reaper. A wave slapped the hull. The sound felt final. When it was over, we stood by the railing. The wind off the channel carried the scent of diesel and faraway rain. Morrison leaned beside me, silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "You think we'll ever open those boxes again?" "Oh, we will," I said. "Someone will." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe the war doesn't end. It just changes laboratories." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that peace meant something more than storage rooms and sealed crates. But I couldn't, because I already knew he was right. A week later, they reassigned me to intelligence analysis in Frankfurt. My job was to catalog what we'd captured: engines, guidance systems, blueprints. I sat in a warehouse filled with the wreckage of genius, half-finished dreams of men we'd sworn to defeat. At night, I'd find myself sketching the Horton from memory, tracing its impossible sweep, trying to understand how beauty could come from such darkness. I wrote Ruth that I'd be home soon. I didn't tell her that every time I closed my eyes, I saw that wing rising from the floor of the factory like a black sunrise. In July, news came from the Pacific, Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The words atomic bomb entered the lexicon, and the world crossed another line it didn't know how to erase. When I saw the photographs, I thought of the Horton again, of how ideas survive even when the men who make them don't. We had ended one war by beginning another invisible kind. By autumn, they sent me home. Illinois smelled like earth and gasoline, the way it always had. The trains ran on time. Children played in the streets again. I sat at my father's workbench, the same lathe humming the same note as before the world came apart. But my hands hesitated over the tools. Everything I touched felt temporary, as if progress itself were just another kind of fire. One evening, I opened my notebook to the last page and read what I had written in Germany. We captured the next war. The ink had bled from rain, but the words still lived. Outside, a jet passed overhead, civilian, silver, loud. The shape of it caught the setting sun, and for a second the wings seemed to merge into one, a dark triangle against the clouds. I stood there listening to its echo fade, thinking how strange it was that silence could sound like flight. The war was over, but somewhere, locked in a warehouse or in the mind of an engineer, the future was already warming its engines. Time, they tell you, smooths everything. It doesn't. It just buries the edges under layers of other noise, new wars, new headlines, new engines. I went home in the summer of '46, married Ruth that autumn. We built a small life that fit inside the silence. A porch, a garden, a radio that played jazz too softly. I took a job at North American Aviation drafting wing spars and control surfaces. By then, the world was flying again, faster and higher every year, and I could trace the curve of the sky through the sweep of the lines on my drawing board. But some nights, when the fluorescent lights hummed just right and the smell of resin filled the room, I'd see it again, the black wing sleeping in its hangar, that shape that didn't belong to any year. I'd run my fingers along the tracing paper and realize we were all still following the same ghost. In '49, someone told me the crates from Cherbourg had been shipped to a new test site in Indiana, Freeman Field. Captured German prototype, they called it. Too advanced scrap. The word stirred something cold in me. We had not buried it. We had only moved it. For decades, it stayed hidden. I built airplanes, raised children, and tried not to dream of engines. The Cold War turned the world into a map of shadows. Jets gave way to rockets, then to missiles, then to rumors of machines that could vanish from radar altogether. Each new leap forward felt strangely familiar. Then, one evening in 1989, I saw it again, on television. The camera panned across a hangar in California, and there it was, a black triangle gliding out from behind a curtain, its skin dull, its edges swept just so. The announcer called it the B-2 Spirit, America's stealth bomber, the most advanced aircraft on Earth. I stood in my living room, unable to breathe. Ruth came in from the kitchen, saw the look on my face, and asked what was wrong. I pointed at the screen. That, I said quietly, is the same thing I found in 1945. She frowned. After all these years? Not the same one, I said, but the same idea, the same ghost. The reporters spoke of radar absorption, composite materials, flying wings. I heard the words again, Radarquerschnitt, Mischung mit Kohle, and felt the air of Friedrich Roda fill the room, warm and metallic. It was as if 40 years had folded in on themselves, and the future had finally caught up with the past. A few years later, I visited the Smithsonian. They had moved the Horton Ho 229 to a new display near Dulles. The wood had darkened with age, the joints cracked slightly, but it was still beautiful, more creature than machine. Tourists walked past without slowing. A boy tugged his father's sleeve, asked what it was. The man said, "Some old German plane," and kept walking. I stood there for a long time. The air smelled faintly of varnish and dust. A small plaque read, "Experimental Jet Aircraft, Germany, 1944. Prototype only, captured by U.S. forces." No mention of what it meant. No mention of what came after. I reached out and touched the glass between us. My reflection wavered over the wing's surface, and for an instant, it looked as if I were standing inside it, part of the shadow. Reimar Horton had died a year earlier in Argentina. I'd read the obituary, visionary aircraft designer, age 79. They quoted him saying, "They perfected my idea." No bitterness, no triumph, just fact. He was right. We had perfected it. We had turned it into the quietest weapon the world had ever built. I left the museum and stepped into the sunlight. A jet passed overhead, its contrail slicing the sky into two halves, one visible, one not. I thought about how history always forgets the names of the men who dreamed too early, and how the rest of us build their dreams into something the world can't forget. Wars end. Inventions don't. That night, I sat on the porch with Ruth, watching fireflies blink in the dark. She asked what I'd seen at the museum. I told her it was beautiful, and I meant it. But I didn't tell her that beauty can frighten a man more than war ever did. Because beauty endures. And endurance is its own kind of weapon. The world is quiet now. Not silent, never silent, but quieter than it used to be. The sounds have changed. Engines are softer, wars are cleaner, and the sky carries ghosts instead of thunder. Sometimes I still wake to the hum of turbines, that low vibration that used to mean survival. It takes me a moment to remember that I'm no longer there, that the black wing sleeps behind museum glass, and I am only its witness, not its keeper. I've come to believe that history isn't a straight line. It loops, folds, and finds new pilots for old machines. The ideas we bury in one century always rise in another, wearing new paint and new promises. The Horton brothers called it flight without shadow. The engineers at Northrop call it stealth. To me, it's the same dream, the one we can't stop chasing, even when it terrifies us. I think about the men who built that plane, about their hands covered in glue and charcoal dust while the walls of their country burned. I think about the engineers who found it again decades later and how their hands were probably the same. Steady, trembling, human. And I think about what connects them, the need to touch the future even when the present can't afford it. If you're listening to this somewhere safe, in a room that smells of coffee and not of oil or smoke, remember that safety is a luxury built on the wreckage of ideas like theirs. The Black Wing never flew in battle, but it still changed the world. So when you look at the sky, at the contrails, at the quiet, dark shapes that leave none, know that you're watching the echoes of 1945, of a factory where the future slept beneath the dust. This was one man's story among millions. One moment where war turned into wonder, and wonder turned into fear. And now I have one question for you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Tell me your city, your country, your sky. Because stories like this one don't belong to the victors or the inventors. They belong to those who remember and to those who still look up.